Welcome everyone to MTG Rebellion's Deck Tech and Sideboard Guide. I'm Darth Rictus of the Darkstream, and today we're going to walk through Domain.
I'm Max Damage. This past weekend we watched Domain take down the Pizza Box Open, Standard Slice, and despite all the hate in the field for it, we're here to show you exactly how it did that and why we really like this deck.
Comment below if you have any questions as we talk through this archetype. Now it's time for our upkeep step. All right. This monstrosity. It just keeps coming back, Max.
Yep.
This is what we get when they ban the things, but not all the things. So, I feel like everybody is pretty familiar with Domain as an archetype at this point. It's only been a week or two, but it was already starting to emerge when Rakdos was at its peak, right? So
yeah, it was a top contender even a few months back before the bans.
Right. So to explain this, I'm going to go through a few individual card choices, but in general, I'm not going to try and explain why we're going to Atraxa. I feel like everybody knows why you go to Atraxa, and everybody knows why we run Leyline Binding in a Domain deck, and why Ossification is good. But let's get to some very specific choices that are made here. I think we're going to start with the fact that there is no Murex in this mana base. I've pulled a bunch of Domain players. I've talked to them about Murex. Not a single one has said Murex was ever critical. Like, there was the occasional odd game that they won on the back of it, but in general, it was never a critical component to the deck. I don't like it. It doesn't help Leyline Binding. It actively works against Ossification, and we get into these scenarios where it gives you the color mana you want, but it doesn't help your Domain count, and after that turn, it's a colorless source in a deck that is very color dependent on what it's trying to do. I don't think it's worth the stumble issue, because that's what you're going to get with Murex occasionally, is you're going to get a stumble. And I don't think it's worth that stumble. I think it's really necessary that you have a very smooth mana base. And this right here, to me, is the smoothest version of the mana base I've ever worked with. It's worth noting that with this mana base, you have multiple scenarios where you can go either Leyline on turn 2 or Ossification on turn 2, with Ziatora's Proving Ground into a Plains, or a Spara's headquarters into either that mountain or swamp. As you can see, there are different ways that you get into this Leyline on turn 2, which is it's important. There are a lot of matchups where you have to do something on turn 2 in terms of interaction, and it's good to know that Leyline is occasionally a turn 2 play for that.
Yeah, and the 2 green on turn 3 is not hard to achieve with this mana base. Also, the 2 white on turn 4 and turn 5. For, just a raw Archangel or the Sunfall in turn 5. It seems to be able to meet the demands of those dual devotion cards on those turns. So huge credit to the mana base here. And I also want to say that it's shifted since the last Domain list before the bans. It's shifted more towards having a lot more basics, which you can have now with the sort of ramp combo that we have in here.
And that pays dividends against one of the hardest matchups, too, that we'll cover, mono red aggro. Those Furnace Punishers, huge issue for most control decks, not an issue for this one. I don't think I've I've literally ever taken 2 damage from a Furnace Punisher with this build. So that's kind of sweet.
Me neither.
Okay, main board. There's only a few other choices that are outside the ordinary. You're going to see the 2 Courier's Briefcase, and I know everybody's going to look at that and think to themselves, why are there no Atalis? Why are there no Breach the Multiverses? First and foremost, let's address Breach versus Atali. Which one's stronger? Breach is. And my reasoning on this is that Breach helps us get Atraxas. It helps grab them in the mirror especially, but it gets us to the point where we are getting Atraxa. And Atraxa is how this deck closes the game out, right? So it's stronger in that it will do that while simultaneously giving you another threat. I've had a couple times where I hit an Atali, and it cranked into, I think, an invasion of Zendikar on my end, and like a make disappear on their end, and then they just killed the Atali, laughed, and moved on. I've never had a Breach resolve that didn't end with me winning the game. I've had multiple Atalis resolve with me still losing afterward. So, Breach versus Atali, I'm going on Breach. That said, I think we're also at a stage in the meta where we can no longer have that many 7-drops. I don't think it's viable. I think we have to be quicker, and that is why we ended up on Courier's Briefcase. What it does is deal with shoring up a few of the issues this deck has. It gets us to those turn 3 Archangels if you just have to have a 3/4 lifelinker against some of those mono-red archetypes. It gets us to those turn 3 Invasion of Zendikars. These are things that we need to get to so that we can ramp quickly into Sunfalls, into the Atraxas. So we're trying to get that acceleration. It also stutter steps Liliana of the Veil, which is also a key issue that this deck faces from time to time. And last but not least, you get to the late game, draw 3 cards. It's a little mini ancestral, and you don't mind because some of these late games, they just go for a while. And it's easy to resolve against the control decks. So that's why we ended up on Courier's Briefcase. The Celestis, I think, is pretty much standard at this point, but if it isn't to you yet, it should be. This card is great. It ramps you into Sunfall. It corrects your mana. And again, as the game goes on, card filtering, life gain, these are huge. Being able to readjust day versus night against Graveyard Trespasser also can be huge.
Yeah, you talked me down from Jodas Codex into this card. What I was achieving with Jodas Codex, being able to get that draw ability every turn, I think the Celestis, with the additional ability of being able to correct your mana, is probably a slightly better choice.
I think Jodas Codex is great if the format slows down again. But right now what we're seeing is a lot of aggro trying to get under domain, and then a lot of control that's set up to put a lot of pressure on while countering the top end of domain. And that's where Jodas Codex is not in a great position. But if we get to a place where it's like domain versus domain a lot of the time, I could see Jodas Codex. So
yeah, a huge caveat to all these adjustments, I just want to say, is like Darth Rictus just pointed out, is adjustments to the meta, slight adjustments. If we see more tempo, more control, some things may change. So bear that in mind as we talk through all these.
Absolutely. And to that end, just some very brief, there are 3 cards in the sideboard worth addressing. I don't think anybody's questioning the 4 Lithomantic Barrage at this point. We all know how good that card is. I also don't see a lot of people questioning the Disdainful Stroke because the mirror match is critical, and there are a few other matchups where this does come in, and we're going to cover that here in a moment. The cards that people are going to question, Thrun versus the Tyrannex Rex, or T-Rex as we call it. I have resolved T-Rex and lost a number of games to Mono Blue, Azorius Control, to Mirror Control because they can interact with it at 6 mana. Fateful Absence plus 4 mana kills the T-Rex. So we've invested 7, they've invested 6, and our threat that was supposed to win the game is dead. That's not where you want to be. Jin, I've had a T-Rex stolen from me with an Invoke the Winds, which feel really rough when they paid 8 mana, took my T-Rex, and then beat me to death with it. Now, this is why I like Thrun. Thrun comes down earlier. Thrun can't be killed, really, outside of a Wrath effect, and they're not keeping those in against you if they're smart anyway, because what the hell are they going to Wrath for? You know what I mean? Like, you're not overloading the board unless it's a herd migration, and then they have to. It's a 1-for-1. So I don't expect to see a lot of Wrath effects coming in, and as long as they aren't, Thrun is just a house in those matchups, and that's why I love this card. It's fantastic. It puts on a quick clock, and it's almost impossible to deal with. To that end, 2 other cards in the sideboard worth addressing. Wandering Emperor. A lot of people are on Depopulate or Vanquish the Horde. I wanted a card that could help with the aggro decks, while also handling one of the deck's primary weaknesses, and that is hasty creatures, such as Tenacious Underdog getting blitzed, or Mishra's Foundry coming out as a manland and being unable, you just can't interact with it if you don't have anything on the board. I've been beaten to death by these cards multiple times throughout my testing, and eventually I realized Wandering Emperor solves that, is good against aggro, a little bit of life gain's nice, but it can also come in against some of these other matchups where we just want to do like end step, tie up their mana with a counterspell as they counter Wandering Emperor so that we can then resolve what we're trying to do on our turn. So it allows you to stutter step the control decks as well. And that's what I really like about it over Depopulate or Vanquish, where it's a very narrow effect that you already have 4 of in the main with Sunfall. So that's why I went this way. And so far it's paid massive dividends. I would consider it. Last but not least in the sideboard, these Elish Norn Mother Machines. People wonder why this card's there. This card is there because it triggers 20 of your permanents, and it shuts down 20 of the mirrors of permanents. Invasion of Zendikar gets double triggered. Atraxa gets double triggered. Leyline gets double triggered. Topiary Stomper gets double triggered. Ossification gets double triggered. All of these things get double triggered with Elish Norn in play. That is a fuckload of effects. Even Courier's Briefcase technically gets 2 creatures out of it. Like, you have so many enters the battlefield effects. This card is a house, and it does a great job in the mirror of allowing you to just shut down their ability to interact. Like, the only way to kill this in the mirror is a Sunfall. That's it. That's literally the out to this in the mirror. Even Lithomantic Barrage can't clean it up. That's why we have 2 of them, because the mirror is
Wow.
going to be out there and we are going to play against it.
Yeah, I discovered this card the hard way in the mirror. As somebody, actually, no, it was playing mono white control. They played this against me. They sideboarded it in, and I didn't know why. And then I tried to ossify, and that did not work.
Yep.
So, yeah, I learned it the hard way. But yeah, speaking of the mirror, if you're ready to go, let's put a minute on the clock and let's talk about how we sideboard for the mirror match.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to cut 2 Archangel of Wrath. I'm going to cut 3 Ossification, and I'm going to board in these 3 Disdainful Strokes and the 2 Elish Norn Mother of Machines. Now, the logic here is that Ossification's kind of awkward in this matchup. Like, it doesn't really do what you're trying to get it to do, and let's say you Ossification their Atraxa, they can still Leyline Binding out your Ossification, get back the Atraxa, and you see this chain play out that isn't in your favor. It's also sorcery speed, which isn't amazing. So we need the Disdainful Strokes. We're trying to keep out their 7-mana Haymakers, and Elish Norn, as we just talked about, it's spicy. Double triggers 20 of our permanents, shuts out 20 of theirs. Very difficult to interact with. I mean, as far as the mirror goes, this is the best plan I've been able to come up with. I know people have different stuff. I've seen Croaking Counterpart, for fuck's sake, as a way to try to break the mirror. I don't recommend those. I think they're cute. I think they're kitschy. I think they're interesting. But ultimately, I just want power. And Elish Norn is power, and Disdainful Stroke is denial of the power on the other end.
Disdainful Stroke is MVP in this sideboard for this matchup. I mean, it's very simple, right? Deny their game plan, enable yours.
Yep.
So yeah, very plain.
Absolutely.
I think people overthink the mirror matches in a lot of decks right now, especially tier 1. This is one where you don't really have to overthink. It's very clear what you want to do. It's a deck that knows what it wants to do, and everybody in the room can see what's about to happen. If you get to turn 7, you know what's about to happen. So yeah, I like this mirror. I like how we set up the sideboard here, especially with the Disdainful Strokes.
And to quickly clarify, with this sideboard the way it is, with this deck the way it is, this is week 2 of the meta. Since the bans, be prepared, because if this deck is as strong as I think it is, and it does continue to explode in popularity, the mirror match is going to take up more and more of your sideboard as you seek to win, as it becomes a higher percentage of the meta. Things will get weird quickly if that happens. So just be ready. We call it an inbred meta, and it's probably going to happen if Domain keeps tromping through people.
Yeah, inbred meta. I remember we were talking about that with Siphon, the Siphon card.
Oh my god!
But
yes,
yeah, if you start to see more Domain, I'm going to be playing Jodas Codex. I'm going to bring that back into the sideboard. I'm going to be playing Breach the Multiverse again. And as we said earlier, things will have to adjust as the meta adjusts. And right now, I think we're looking at a very aggro-heavy, creature-heavy sort of meta. So that's prepared to take on, but still with solutions for the mirror. I dig it.
Absolutely. And if you need more advice on what's happening in the meta, check out our other videos, because we're going to be publishing a state of the meta here that should give you a little bit more information about what to expect.
I can't wait. Let's talk about another deck that wants that tier 1 status but hasn't quite achieved it yet post-ban. But nonetheless, still a threat, huge threat. Azorius Soldiers. What is the best way to sideboard against Azorius Soldiers?
Against Azorius Soldiers, we're going to bring in these Lithomantic Barrages, and we're going to bring in a couple Wandering Emperors. We're going to board out 3 Invasion of Zendikar, and we're going to board out 3 Atraxa Grand Unifier. And the reason for this is we don't need to get to Atraxa to win this matchup. The Archangel, combined with the Sunfalls and all the other ways we're stutter stepping them, like, our threats naturally are already larger than what they can handle. A single herd migration will probably end the game. A Sunfall at the right time will probably wipe out what they have for resources, and Archangel often 3-for-1s. We have great threats. We don't need Atraxa to lock this game down. They're going to be hoping we leave Atraxa in because they want easy things to counter. Whereas what we're doing right now is we're going a little bit lower on the curve. We're saying, okay, we don't have time for multiple Invasion of Zendikars. At worst, we can get 1 through. But we need to kill things with barrages, we need to stutter step them with Emperor, and we need to move towards the game plan of Sunfall, Archangel, and Herd Migration taking over.
Yeah, I agree that the deck, without the 7 drops, is still a very powerful list. Leyline Binding, Archangel, Sunfall. I mean, you're going to be able to withstand a lot of the initial waves of aggro attacks and then be able to take control, stabilize, and then do your thing. The Archangel in particular, when I saw 4 of in the very first domain list I ever encountered post-ban, I was like, oh, wow, okay. I see what this deck's trying to do. It's trying to have threats before it gets to, you know, the 7-drop slots, not just trying to ramp there. So, yeah, Angel puts in work in these aggro matchups for sure.
Absolutely. And the trend you're going to notice across all of these, very often I am sideboarding out Atraxa, because very often the sideboard plan of the opposing deck is to deal with Atraxa. And so you can short circuit what they are trying to do and give yourself an immense advantage by understanding how you can board against that idea.
Yeah, totally. Let's talk about something on the other side of the spectrum here. Azorius Control. This deck is back. We've sort of discussed it before, but tell us, how can we defend against Azorius Control?
Alrighty. For the current iterations of Azorius Control, I'm looking at boarding in all 3 Disdainful Strokes, the 2 Wandering Emperors, and all 3 Thrun Breaker of Silence. What I'm going to board out are going to be 4 Sunfalls and 4 Atraxas. The reason is very simple. They are going to counter the top end of our curve. They are set up to do that, and our Wrath effects also are just dead here. So we go a little sleeker. We push Thrun, because Thrun just pushes right through almost everything they're doing. Lithomantic can potentially come in depending on their build and whether or not they're heavy into Chrome Seed Sharks or not. But unless we're seeing that, we're just using Disdainfuls to keep their Teferis, Wandering Emperors, and Eternal Wanderers off the battlefield. And we're using Thruns to push through, with Wandering Emperor as a method of getting around their farewells and applying pressure to the board state.
Yeah. Getting around farewell, very critical.
There's
and I think, go ahead.
I mean, there's an argument on losing the Ossifications for that reason, but the fact that they can just clean up a walker right after it drops makes it a little too difficult for me to say, let's just get rid of Ossification, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. I can see how that's different from the previous matchup in the, you know, where you would want to sort of toss away Ossification because it's awkward in the mirror. But
right
here, and not dealing with the mirror, yeah, I can sort of, yeah. God, that's a sticky point right there, whether to toss the Ossifications or not. But yeah, I can see being on your side of the fence with that one.
When we see these Azorius Control decks in Ossification, I think if you toss the Ossification, it'll be for the Lithomantic barrages, and it'll depend on how many farewells we see and what kind of threats we see. So if it's, you know, Baby Sharks, Teferis, Eternal Wanderers, Lithomantic barrage might just be stronger. But if we're seeing anything on top of that, anything outside of that color spectrum that we're worried about, Ossification gets the nod. So it really depends on what we're seeing.
Yeah.
But be aware of that. Litho versus Ossification, that's the debate for Azorius Control.
Are you seeing, just really quickly, are you seeing more of the Baby Shark being the win con with Azorius Control than you are anything else? Or is that an uncommon thing?
It depends if it's my build or somebody else's. if it's my build,
fair.
Yeah, if it's my build, like Azorius Control can kind of go into a token mode where they're playing Wedding Announcements, Baby Sharks, and Wandering Emperors, and that's low ball, and that's what I like to do. But I know a lot of people have pushed more towards the high end with Eternal Wanderers and Teferi. Was it Temporal Pilgrim, whatever the 5-drop one is, and that's where you know, I don't know. That's where I wonder which way you want to go. You know, like if it's against the token version, I like Ossification. If it's against the Teferi Eternal Wanderer version, it might be correct to go Lithomantic, because those will clean up those walkers for 1 mana uncounterably while also killing the shark.
That makes sense. Let's move on to the next list. This one I consider a tier 1. Let's talk about the list that I think, personally, Lithomantic Barrage was made to play against. Esper Legends. How do we sideboard Legends?
So against Esper Legends, we're going to bring in these Lithomantic Barrages, just like you said, and we're going to bring in these 2 Wandering Emperors.
No surprises.
Right? we're gonna take out 3 Atraxas and 3 Invasion of Zendikars. Now again, our top end is going to get countered based on how they've repositioned this archetype, and turn 4 playing Invasion of Zendikar is not very strong against a deck that functions on tempo. because we're basically time walking ourselves to push towards an Atraxa, which is giving them notice of when they need to counter something while simultaneously giving them a time walk effect. So that's why these are coming out for cheaper removal and interaction, because we will eventually get to 7 mana regardless. This deck plays 26 lands and a lot of ways to fetch them between Topiary Stomper, Herd Migration, Invasion, Courier's Briefcase, Celestis. These are all ways to ramp. We're going to get to the 7 mana. And I think it's fine to leave in a copy of Atraxa and a copy of Invasion. We just don't want to see a duplicate of either because they'll be super clunky in our hand and just sit there. And we don't need to see either in the matchup, frankly.
That makes sense. Esper Legends has gotten very aggressive since Rona and Skrelv, and you got to do something about that. And having 3 copies of Atraxa in your starting hand does not help, does not provide a good scenario at all. So, yeah, I agree. I agree with taking out Atraxa in this matchup in particular.
Alrighty. Should we push forward into everybody's super favorite deck?
Oh, my gosh. I hate that this deck is back, but and it's not really that much different from what it was before, right? Like, there's really very few changes. But let's talk about mono blue. What do we do against mono blue?
This is considered the death knell matchup for Domain, but there are ways through it. So I do 4 Lithomantic Barrage, the single Unlicensed Hearse. This is what it's here for. The 2 Wandering Emperors. And all 3 Thrunts are going to come in. We're going to board out all the Atraxas, all the Invasions, and a couple of Sunfalls here. We aren't ramping against them. We're just managing the game state. If you land an early Unlicensed Hearse, you might just get the game on that alone. Like, I had a game I beat mono blue because I landed a Hearse, and I just exiled every single turn. So their Tolarian Terrors were always about 6 or 7 mana. Their Haughty Djinns were always 0/4s. I literally watched 2 Haughty Djinns sit on the battlefield, and I just held Lithomantic Barrage for the Tolarian Terrors because I didn't have to deal with the Djinns. They had no way to deal with the Hearse. And so it's a slugfest in this. Thrun is your best threat. They can't steal it, they can't fuck with it, they can't counter it. The only way that it dies in that matchup is if you have to use it to block a Tolarian Terror. Otherwise, it's getting through and it's winning the game for you.
Holy moly. Yeah, Thrun is proving very valuable for the sideboard. And I think, wow, that's crazy. Wandering Emperor also, adds some value here to being able to counter what they're trying to do, which is really more of a mid-range tempo kind of game. Are there any other kind of pieces, interactions here that we should be aware of?
I mean, you're going to use Wandering Emperor more often than not to tap down some mana on their turn so that you can push through something on yours. Like, there are many times where I've done a Wandering Emperor on their end step while they had a Haughty Djinn in play, just to force them to tap down so that I could get a Sunfall resolved on my turn to get rid of the Djinn, or to get a, push like a Topiary Stomper or an Archangel through. And so you just have to be aware that that's really what they're there for. They're going to get countered 99% of the time. That's fine. We want them to be countered because they provide access for us to get something on our turn a lot of the time.
Okay. Yeah. And that's also why Farewell doesn't work in this matchup, is they're going to counter it more likely than not. You need the small answers.
And that's why we board out Atraxa. I have never resolved an Atraxa against mono blue. I don't think I ever will. Like, 7 mana and they have like 12 2-mana ways to counter it. It's not getting through, guys. Yeah. Like, we can't live in a land where we think Atraxa is just going to resolve because we pray and hope that it will against a deck filled with counters. No. Just, we board it out. Yeah. It's not going to work.
That makes sense. That makes total sense. You cut off a limb to save the whole body for sure on that one.
Exactly.
All right. Let's go in the other direction with a deck that, it's back as well. And this deck also seems to get under my skin when I'm playing Domain. I tend to have a tough time with it, and I imagine some of our viewers out there might as well. Let's talk about mono red aggro. What do we do against mono red aggro? And in particular, are we set up to play against their Furnace Punisher, which is supposed to be their tool against us?
I'll preface this before I get to the minute on the clock. This sideboarding strategy is very weird, and I know a lot of people will disagree with it, but I did just take down somebody in the top 500 of Mythic using it, and it didn't feel that hard. So, prefacing with that, here we go. For mono red aggro, I'm boarding out all 4 copies of Atraxa and 2 copies of Invasion of Zendikar. I'm boarding in 2 Thruns, 2 Elish Norns and 2 Wandering Emperors. Now, the logic here is that we don't have time for redundant copies of Invasion of Zendikar, nor do we want to resolve Atraxa against them, because they have Bloody Betrayal, at least as the 3 of. Some copies, I've seen up to 6 steal effects between Bloody Betrayal and Furnace Rains. They're going to take it if you play it. They're going to beat you over the head with it. They basically get a 3 mana deal 7 damage to you spell if you play the Atraxa in this matchup. They are prepared for Atraxa. That is what they are there to deal with, right? We push Thrun, we push Elish Norn, we push Wandering Emperor because we're trying to get to a mid game that they can't get through. And Thrun is actually a weird reason that I've won this matchup multiple times, because I'll just play it and it'll sit there. And cool, that's all we need it to do most of the time. Eventually it'll beat him to death, but in the meantime, it just sits there. Last but not least, as you addressed, Furnished Punisher, not amazing against a deck that plays this many basics and this many ways to get to basics. I've actually never had to take the 2 from Furnished Punisher in a constructed match on the ladder.
I just wanted to hear you say it again.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah, that card used to give me problems. I don't know, but the way that the mana base is set up here, I think it's fine. Yeah, I think it's fine. So on your journey with this deck, has Mono Red, in previous iterations since the ban, did Mono Red give you problems as well? And have you are some of your adjustments as a result of Mono Red? Is that fair to say?
So I haven't actually lost to it, but I've come close multiple times, and I've been adjusting the sideboard because I was not loving how coin flippy it felt. Like, there were way too many scenarios where I'm like, if I don't have the turn 2 Ossification or Leyline Binding, oh shit, this matchup's not going to go well. So I'm like, okay, we need to adjust some pieces here. And I was surprised by how efficient and effective Elish Norn is against them as well, because they do play that bloodthirsty, or what is it, Blood Tithe Adversary, I believe is what it's called.
Yeah, Blood Tithe Adversary.
Right, and Elish Norn just shuts that the fuck down, which is lovely. And there's, you know, a few other things that it does, but like their Thundering Raiju going up against Elish Norn, giggle, we win. You know, like there just isn't a lot you can do. It's a 4/7 wall. They can't kill it with almost anything, and it's got vigilance, so you just beat them in the head for 4 every single turn, while simultaneously making sure they can't do shit, and all of your Ossifications now hit 2 permanents. All your Leylines hit 2 permanents. Like, it's really, really powerful in what it does as the game goes on, while being a giant, thick wall that they can't get past. And that's why we're going this way with it.
Yeah, I love the idea of making Furnace Rains and Bloody Betrayal irrelevant. Like, I love it. Their solutions don't do anything.
Exactly. And they can't push through the board state because we have individual removal, we have mass removal, we've got sticky threats, life gain. Like, this, it's a lot better than people think it is as a matchup, as long as you sideboard it correctly.
Yeah, I really like Domain 5-color. I like this iteration of it even more. This deck has taken a dominant spot in the tier 1 sector of the meta, as we discussed last week in last week's state of the meta for Standard. Go check out that video. We've got another one coming, though, so stay locked to this channel, subscribe, and you'll get updates on when we go with that video, go live with it. That video is going to discuss even further any sort of adjustments since last week, and I think it's safe to say we're going to see Domain still have a top slot in that tier list.
Oh yeah,
it definitely deserves it. The way it took down the pizza box and the way it's performing on ladder for me and for you, I think speaks. How high are you in Mythic right now with it?
Top 500 last I checked, although I probably decayed. You know what? We can just show people. 504. Yeah. Okay,
that's fair.
So just over it now.
Yeah,
it's done well for me. I think I'm sitting at like 12-2 with it right now. So it's done extremely well. And the 2 losses we learned from, and we made adjustments, which is how you got the list we just presented.
Yeah, we've been fine tuning it to address some of its weaknesses. This is a deck that has shored up its weaknesses in a fine-tuned mode, and like we've given the caveat, and like we've said, if things adjust, if the meta adjusts, then there are still some adjustments you can make to the sideboard and the main board that respond accordingly. So I think this deck is flexible enough to remain a tier 1 list for quite some time. But if you agree, disagree, if you feel totally differently, please comment below, ask any questions you have. We are totally willing to go there with you and talk about that with you in the comments. So go ahead and do that. Darth Rictus, are there any sort of final comments you have regarding Domain 5-color?
No, if you think you have a better build, please post it in the comments below and let's talk about it. I am way too active on the comments section, but I will sit there and have a debate
really
for
are.
literal hours about these decks because I love doing it. So, you know, say hi. We're here.
Comment. Don't forget to like, subscribe. And until next time, from all of us at the MTG Rebellion, untap, upkeep, resist.